let's just take a moment, and you may or may not know, but the person at Altair who really has rolled up her sleeves and worked really hard to make this event a success is Anna Nichols. And and she really sweated the details, and I think it shows. So thank you very much. So, a testament to planning. And so we've been talking about planning all day, of course. And this morning we talked about well-being, and that well-being has these three dimensions, right? There's the prosperity, health, and happiness. Prosperity, that's about planning in the financial and the physical world to have well-being and control and manage what's going on in our financial and physical world. And then in our panel we talked about, and we know that we can plan that, obviously that's why you're here. And then in our panel we talked about health, which is the management of our physical body, and that as it turns out there are data-driven ways of managing and controlling and planning for that as well. And especially medical technology keeps growing, and so these early diagnostic tests and markers are getting better all the time. So as it turns out, we don't just have to wing that. We can actually use data analysis and planning. And we talked about the fact, too, that there are subjective and objective aspects of both of those dimensions. That objectively, you have sufficiency of retirement income, but subjectively, you may be worried about that. You may feel like you don't have enough money, or vice versa. You may feel like you have enough. And when you actually crunch the numbers and look at the statistical analysis of likely returns, the truth is maybe you don't for that lifestyle. So we've got this dance between how we feel about it and the science of it. Health-wise, that's also true. We can feel fine, but we need to get the science to see what's going on with our body. So what about happiness? Is it really true that there is some science behind understanding what's likely to make us happy, and that we can take some plans to be happier? That's what this afternoon is about. So the three questions for this afternoon, first of all, an obvious one, does retiring make us happy? Secondly is, what does the science say about happiness? Is there really scientific research into what makes people happy? And then lastly, to make it more personal, is planning to be happy. So, does retiring make us happy? Well, it depends, really. If you feel like you're beating your head against a wall, let alone maybe if you literally are, then yes, retiring makes you happy. Thinking back to when we invented retirement a century ago, it was kind of modeled on the idea that most jobs at the time, they really were nasty, dirty, dangerous jobs, and the idea of simply not working in and of itself was a relief. It would make people happy. And we extended that idea of retirement beyond industrial jobs into white-collar jobs and professional jobs. And so simply not working in whatever kind of work you've been engaged in, the absence of that work is probably not enough to bring about happiness. What if your work is the opposite of that? What if your work is about using a high level of skill and knowledge to do something that's challenging in a positive way, something that's meaningful, something that gives you social status, something that maybe gives you a view of the world when you're doing that kind of work that few people even have? What if doing that work means that you have colleagues or associates that you work with who are likewise fully engaged? And what if, when you stop doing that work, you realize that that was the coolest and most rewarding thing that you could have been doing, and you maybe won't ever do anything that engaging again? If that is your situation, then retiring, it doesn't make you happy. Now, let's be honest, though, most kinds of work are not either or, they combine the two. Some part of your day or your work, you feel like you're beating your head against the wall. And some part of your day, you feel like you're at, 50,000 feet or whatever it is. And so part of the personal answer to this is to start to become as aware as possible. Well, of the work I'm doing now, which are the parts that are like beating my head against the wall? Which are the parts that elevate me, that bring me to this higher level of experience? And to start to scheme and plan about doing less of the former and more of the latter. And that the attraction of consulting, for example, for some people, or the attraction of taking a more strategic role in an organization, right, is to let go of some of the aggravations, to let go of some of the punishing workload, and to try to key in on the most rewarding parts. And it's your own experience, it's your own stories, it's you, as you think back about the past and the present, and you start making those distinctions. You can even write 2 lists. I want to do less of this, I want to do more of that. And then the creative approaches you find to do that are unique to you. But that also aids us in this process, remember, of making gradual transitions. It's literally, I think, more natural for humans to do that. And so one of the ways we make it a natural and enjoyable and rewarding transition is making these distinctions about the things to let go of and the things to amplify or to hold on to. Does that make sense? Right. So what does the science say about happiness? So for about the last 10 or 15 years, there's actually been a shift in the research psychology world. And now there are a lot of people involved, but really one of the pioneers was a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania named Martin Seligman. Has anybody heard of him? Okay, Marty Seligman. So I trained with him because he was the pioneer who, after an esteemed career not in therapy or in counseling or psychiatry, but in research psychology. He did university-based research. But after decades as an esteemed researcher, he pointed out that they had used all of these experimental and statistical tools and powers of analysis mostly to study what was wrong with people psychologically. They'd studied unhappiness, depression, anxiety, things like that, and could very well document all of those things in society and in individuals. And he simply pointed out that all of these powerful tools of analysis they developed could be put to another purpose, which was to study human happiness, to study a positive psychology. And so he was president of the American Psychology Association at the time, and so he had kind of a rallying cry, and he started to raise money, lots of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to start studying human success and happiness and fulfillment and all of these positive aspects of psychological function. And now there's about a good 10 years of research, and so we're getting better and better ideas all the time about what really does bring happiness. So, but let me make it very simple. Let me share the secret of happiness. As it turns out, we think about happiness in a fairly broad way. But one of the first findings that Martin Seligman identified was 3 paths to happiness, or 3 ways of being happy. And each is quite distinct from each other. So when we think about happiness, usually we think about pleasure or enjoyment or positive emotions, right? So laughing, smiling, feeling positive emotions in our body, it's watching a comedy or enjoying a sporting event or something like that. We're really aware and conscious of the happiness in the moment. And of course, kids are really good at this. And as adults, often we're not as good. But that's one distinct path to happiness. But he discovered 2 other paths. And the second one, which he called engagement, the pioneer in that area was actually a fellow at the University of Chicago by the name of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Anybody heard of him? Okay. And he studied a phenomenon that he then coined a term or applied a term to it And what he started out by studying were artists and athletes. And he said, I noticed that these people, when they are engaged in their work, as we would define work for them, that they go into a state of consciousness where they're totally focused, they're using their skills and abilities towards some positive challenge, and that oftentimes they get a time distortion. You know, they're working at this thing, and it feels like it's been 5 minutes, but if you look at the clock, it's been 20 minutes. And they lose themselves in their work. And that was a phenomenon he noticed in athletes and in artists. And he termed that state flow, the flow state. Now, that's very different than, like, go with the flow, dude. Okay, that's not that flow. It's this very, focused kind of concentration. And what's really interesting is that he discovered it wasn't just artists and athletes who do that. Anyone can do that. And so he began to interview and study, and this was actually before common use of smartphones, but he actually put pagers, remember old-fashioned pagers, on people, and gave them a little tablet, and he would randomly, by the thousands, he would send pager signals to these people, and then they'd stop and they'd write what they were doing and what their emotional state was, what was going on, and collected literally millions of data points like that. And what he discovered was that far beyond the select group that he first thought, anyone doing almost anything can go into flow if it's a good fit for them, if their skills and abilities are a good fit for this positive challenge that they're taking on. And that when people were, when the challenge often exceeded their skills and abilities, instead of flow, they would go into anxiety and stress. But on the other hand, if this challenge was below their skills and abilities, they'd go into a state of boredom. And so it went all the way down to the case where he was studying people who were doing landscaping. And so at the opposite end, from artists and athletes, you found people who were doing manual labor and likewise going into the flow state. And so that is this second path to happiness. And one reason it's so different than that first one, the pleasure or enjoyment, is because when you're in flow or engagement, you're not aware of any emotions. You're so focused. It's only after you get done that you stop and you say, boy, where did the time go? That was great. Right? So it's a totally different thing than the pleasure or positive emotions, where you know you're having fun, right? The engagement one is you're not aware of it at the moment. Now, I'll give you one guess. Where are people most likely, or where and when are people most likely to have engagement or flow? At work. Yes, at work. So, this goes back to that idea about finding the parts of your job that bring you into engagement and the flow state, and finding ways to replicate those or duplicate those out in the world if you're going to leave work that gives you flow. Does that make sense? And you're the expert. You're the expert on what does that. What's the third path to happiness? The third path is a sense of meaning and purpose. And this is different than the other two, because people who have a sense of meaning or purpose, and they report a high level of happiness or life satisfaction, they don't necessarily have the pleasure and positive emotions. They might actually be engaged in pursuits that aren't pleasant at all. Sometimes they even aren't necessarily engaged. Instead of going into the flow state, they're just, gritting their teeth and getting themselves through it. But the purpose for which they're engaging in that activity is so transcendently meaningful to them that they say, yeah, it's worth it. Sounds like parenting, doesn't it? No, not really. And so it's fundamentally different. How do you know that something is meaningful or purposeful? The shorthand answer is that when you are aligned with something greater than yourself, that's when we get a sense of meaning. Okay, so when you're in the service of something greater than you or larger than you in some way, then that's where it's coded in our experience to say, wow, this feels meaningful. So, so let's recap a little bit, because knowing that these things are fundamentally different but not mutually exclusive is important. There are experiences we have where we get all three from that experience. It literally feels fun, it's totally engaging, and when we step back, we say, yeah, that is meaningful. I have a sense of purpose while I'm doing this. And I call that a trifecta experience. You literally have things that you do that do all three. I worked with one fellow who coached kids' sports. And in the sport that he was coaching, he enjoyed the sport so much that he actually thought it was fun at the time, you know. It was engaging because he wasn't naturally a coach. He actually had another job. So he had to really focus and work on being a good coach. So he had skin in the game. He really had to work at it to coach. And I said, obviously, you know, it's meaningful because you're helping the next generation. He said, yeah, I'm helping the next generation. And in fact, 3 of the kids I've coached have gotten college scholarships. You know, so talk about the meaning and purpose needle, you know, moving and, you know, actually getting some feedback. And so that was a really good example of here he had this activity he was engaged in, and it covered all 3. But don't feel like you have to do that. That would be being a happiness overachiever, right? So, so to illustrate this, and I apologize for the sports analogy, but if we take a subject like baseball, for example, so going to a Cubs game or a Sox game would be an example of pleasure or enjoyment, right? So you probably go with your friends, it's a beautiful day, and the grass is green and the sky is blue, and you've got a beer and some popcorn, and you're just immersed in the experience, right? It's just fun, and it doesn't ask anything of you other than to have fun. And so that's an example of baseball as pure pleasure. What about engagement? Well, that might be playing baseball, right? You have to put on a glove, you go out on the field, you might win, you might lose, there's something at stake, you've got to use your skills, and while you're playing the game, you're so focused, it doesn't feel like fun, right? You're totally in the game, but at the end of the game, that's when you say, wow, that was great. So that's engagement. What about meaning? Well, I think we're back to there. That might be coaching Little League. It might be raising money to build a ball field for kids, right? In fact, that might be unpleasant. Like asking strangers for money is like one of the things that most of us really dislike doing. But going and doing that, raising money, and then seeing that ball field built for Little League or something, that's a testament to a sense of meaning and purpose. So all 3 stories are about baseball, but yet different manifestations of how we can invest ourselves and derive happiness from that. Does that make sense? You can see how those different varieties of experience. So we have a special opportunity now that we know how these things are different. One word that's been used a lot here today is the word portfolio. So what is a portfolio? There are lots of kinds of portfolios. You know, a portfolio isn't just a collection. So if we took a bunch of things that were similar and collected them into a collection, it wouldn't necessarily be a portfolio, right? So most portfolios, the idea is that it's comprised of things that are different in some way and meaningfully different. They're different in a way that makes a difference. The simplistic explanation, and I am not the expert in the room on this subject, but the simple explanation of the modern idea of a portfolio is from something called modern portfolio theory. Has anybody heard of that? Modern portfolio theory, okay? So 1950, And people have been investing money for a long time, and there are a lot of ideas about how to invest in a smart way and how to combine investments. But finally, it was not until 1950 when a genius by the name of Harry Markowitz said, well, let's statistically look at different asset classes to see if there's a reason or a justification to combine them in some way. So he looked at the historical risk and return, or the variation in value between three asset classes, between stocks, bonds, and cash, and he actually showed empirically that there was an advantage to combining those asset classes into a portfolio that maintained a higher level of return while reducing risk or volatility. He proved that, and for that and some other work, he ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, it sounds obvious now, and most good ideas, once they're accepted, sound obvious. But believe me, it was a pioneering thing to do. And so we can take this idea and recognize that the power of that portfolio comes from the difference between these elements. I'm going to suggest in a few minutes that what you can do is to take the difference between these types of happiness, or paths to happiness, and we can construct a portfolio that's more likely to lead to happiness in your life, so that you really can start to plan the activities that are more likely to bring about happiness. And you do it by combining these fundamentally dissimilar activities into your happiness portfolio. So let's look a little bit closer at each of these, and you might start to think or get an idea of some activities in your own life that might be triggered by these. So people say, well, when I'm thinking about what I want to do in the future and I'm planning for the next stage of life and I want to plan to be happier, should I look for things that I've already done in the past that have made me happy, or should I be thinking about trying new things that I might be happy with? And I would say it's a combination of that. That the process I really suggest is you first think about, you take the empirical data, right? You take your actual lived experience and look back at those things in your life that have brought about these different approaches to happiness, because that's real data. You're not just guessing, you're not hoping, you're not wishing. You're relying on your own lived experience. And then within those experiences, you look for the seeds, you look for the themes, you look for the hints about how you might carry those out into new experiences that you haven't tried. Does that make sense? So you're not just leaping off into kind of a guess about what might bring about that happiness, but you have some clues. So pleasure, engagement, and meaning. Pleasure and enjoyment. Now guess what? This is the one that people don't usually have trouble coming up with. If we said, write down 10 things that you find, just fun and enjoyable, almost everybody can come up with a list. And one reason is because we tend to do this in our working life. We do this on the weekends and we do this on vacation, and this is the counterbalance to work, right? So the pleasure and enjoyment, that's the counterbalance. It's going to work is what makes this so fun. And some people mistakenly think that they can create a whole retirement life based on pleasure and enjoyment. But of course, it's the contrast with work that makes it so great. So it's a good place to start. It's absolutely essential. I'm a big fan of pleasure and enjoyment. And it's also not enough to build a life on. Now, by the way, remember that old-fashioned original idea of retirement being about leisure? Well, this is it. This is it. Just having fun. Engagement and challenge. Now, this is the one that the seeds or the themes might actually come from your work life. Now, here's a funny thing about this flow state in engagement and challenge. What it does is it takes unique skills and abilities that you have, you apply those to some Herculean task, which you know that you can perform. But people on the outside, they look at that and they say, wow, that looks like a lot of work. But on the inside, you're saying, no, it doesn't feel like work. This is like my natural thing, and I'm good at it, and I'm totally focused, and I like it. but on the outside, to other people, it looks like work. So here's the interesting thing about planning this for your next stage of life, is that you have social pressure not to do it. When you tell people about some of your plans for having engagement and challenge in your retirement life, they'll say, oh, don't do that, just go have fun. And so you have a little pushback. You may have to be secretive and not share some of these plans with everybody, because socially, the social pressure is to not do that. So I would urge you to, in fact, say, you know, I think I'm going to research and come up with some ideas that I can find positive challenges. And I know that other people are going to think that I'm working or something like that, but I know it doesn't feel like work. Right? Meaning and purpose. You know, the illustration that you have in your packet and you saw here where I put this in a pyramid, it's not that really any of these are higher or better than the others. Martin Seligman says they're all equally valid. The reason I put them in that pyramid is because, especially for retirement, to get all three of these is a little bit like climbing a mountain in some ways. That people expect us, and our automatic idea is to go for pleasure and enjoyment, but we've got to scale the mountain a little bit to say, well, no, I also want to have engagement and a positive challenge in retirement. And then the reason meaning is at the top is because it's overlooked. We don't stop and think about it. And that's because meaning and purpose, right, is about being part of something larger than ourselves. In earlier stages of life, that tends to be automatic. So when we start our profession or a career and we're part of an organization or a family business, or let alone if we start our own business, it automatically feels meaningful, right? We're engaged in something that's bigger than we are, and so without trying to or planning for that, it feels meaningful. If we have kids, raising kids, even though it can be a challenge sometimes, it is, again, inherently meaningful, right? And transitioning into the third age of life or transitioning into retirement, there's not automatically some source of meaning. It doesn't just automatically show up like with these other life activities and life stages. So unless we do some planning for it, it may not be there. Here's the other thing, here's the tricky thing about meaning, and that is that we can transition to retirement and we can do just fine without a specific sense of meaning. But what we discover, or can discover, is that as the years go on, that sense of meaning or purpose, it can start to erode. And we don't notice it. It actually just goes down little by little by little because we're not actually fueling or feeding into a sense of meaning and purpose. And then we can wake up one day and realize that we really don't have a sense of meaning or purpose in life. So it can sneak up on us. We get there little by little. And, you know, meaning that you don't have to save the planet to have a sense of meaning. It can literally, it could be from the environment, but it could be your community. It could be it could be as small as your nuclear family. It could be your neighborhood. It could be your political party. It could be your church. All those things are greater than we are. They're all bigger than we are. They will outlast us, right? And so it doesn't have to be monumental, but it does have to be bigger than we are. So some years ago, I was speaking in Washington, D.C., and in the morning before the event, I was looking at the Washington Post, and there was an article that caught my eye, and it said, local psychiatrist working with elderly. And I looked at the article, and the story was about a geriatric psychiatrist, right, with elderly people, who was working with elderly people who had they had retirement financial security, they were in good health, but they were unhappy. They needed a psychiatrist at that age. And there was a quote that he had that jumped off the page. And so I typed up this slide and I shared it in the presentation. And in the back of the room, a lady raised her hand. She said, "Larry's my husband." And so I took that as a signal that I really should keep this slide, so I've used it ever since. And I think it does get right to the heart of it. And I think certainly planning how to matter, that really involves about finding the sense of meaning and purpose that will sustain you through time. Is all this making sense? So just like modern portfolio theory, where we combine these different asset classes that have different characteristics to create a portfolio, well, now that we know that there are 3 paths to happiness, we actually can identify kinds of activities that are likely to be associated with each of those classes, and to start to imagine a portfolio of things that we want to do, which collectively, it's synergistic, right? That there's actually a power in the combination of those things, rather than putting all our eggs in one basket, right? Like, I'm going to do this one thing in retirement, and that one thing will make me happy. Like, I'll be with my grandkids all the time, then I'll be happy. Or I'll, win the tennis tournament, then I'll be happy. And that's putting all your eggs in one basket. And the first thing Altair would tell you to do is never put all your eggs in one basket. And that's true of a path to happiness, too. So let's do this. Oh, yeah, can we plan to be happy? Well, everybody knows. Yes, we can plan to be happy. So when we talk about investments, so there's a Chicago area firm that pioneered a really simple way of understanding asset classes, right? And we had a visual way of understanding that. Modern portfolio theory is based on this idea of combining these different things and essentially getting a better outcome from the combination than we could by either of those separately. And so that's what we can do with happiness. So if we take this handout that's on your table and pass those things around. Now, when you first look at this, it looks it might look like a lot of empty space, but it's really not, and I'll explain why, and then we'll go through an actual kind of a extreme example to show you how easy this kind of thing can be. So if we look on the left-hand side, you recognize these 3, right? So here are our 3 paths to happiness: pleasure and engagement and challenge, meaning and purpose. Now here is the tricky part. The other thing that makes these activities different is who you do them with. And it also gives us a lot more control over our approaches to happiness. One of the first things that does happen to people when they leave away from a kind of work they've been doing is that they pull themselves out of a social network or a social environment that they're engaged with. And we think we're going to see those same people and everything, but we all, we've seen it before. You just don't see those people as much as when you're working. So identifying things you can do by yourself is an important bridge to that. Now, by the same token, though, some people who disengage from their work, they overly focus on that. And the real trick then is to step up a level, find something you can do with another person. You can almost always find one person, right? And then the big one is things you can do with a group. And most of the time, that is identifying an existing group in the world that's doing something and joining that group. It's way easier to join a group than to start a group. And sometimes it doesn't work. We try to join groups and we're not accepted or we don't like it, so it takes some experimentation. But finding a way to do all 3 kinds of these activities is really valuable. So let's start with a simple idea, and I'll just illustrate for you, kind of in an extreme way, that once you put your thinking cap on, you'll be surprised at the options you can come up with to explore. Okay, so here's a completely hypothetical example, but it gives you a clue about once you start thinking in this way about the things that may pop up in your mind. Now, do we have any gardeners here? Anybody who loves or knows a lot about gardening? Okay, so I apologize because I'm not a gardener. In fact, I'm horticulturally illiterate. Okay, I don't know much about gardening. So therefore, I chose gardening, of course, as the idea. So I said, what if somebody just loved gardening? And that was their idea. And maybe they were putting all their eggs in one basket. They were going to just make gardening their thing. Well, if that, I'm sorry. That's all right, this stands on its own. So what Frank needed to do was this exercise to get out of the house, and no doubt if he were, his marriage would be better too. So I don't usually talk much about gender things because people are individuals, they're not just their gender. But I will tell you something that we probably all observed, which is that oftentimes women are better at identifying these ranges of activities with different people. And even if they're really career focused, they often keep those balls in the air and they have all these things going on. And not to stereotype, but men often are more concentrated, and that working role is such a big thing that when we remove that role from our lives, there's literally this vacuum, right? So don't be like Frank. So let's take gardening. Gardening. So let's just start here in the corner. So what would be fun by yourself with gardening? And that would just be reading gardening books, especially maybe in the winter, right? So it's fun to read it, look at the pictures. You can do it by yourself, but it's not really expecting anything of you. It's just an enjoyable pastime. But engagement and challenge, doing something by yourself, would be like create a gardening plan, right? You've got to look at your lot and the soil and the sun and shade and perennials and annuals. And working out a plan, now you actually have to learn and work at that. And so that's engaging, but you don't need anybody else to do it. And then meaning and purpose, maybe if it was your grandmother or your grandfather or a parent is the one who introduced you to this thing that you love doing, that maybe writing a short story, like as a memoir that could be in your family, that would commemorate your parent or grandparent in some way, that's an artifact that could survive beyond you in your family. And of course, you do that on your own, you know, it's like a creative writing exercise. So obviously, this really has nothing to do with gardening. You can just see where I'm going with it. What about an activity with another person? Well, pleasure and enjoyment with another person, maybe that would be visiting a botanical garden with a friend. You can always find one person, you go, and it's like going to the ball game or something. It doesn't require anything of you, it's just fun, but you're with another person doing it. Planting a garden with a partner, now that's actually some work, or it looks like work. And so you've got to rise to that occasion and work together to do it. And then meaning and purpose. What if you had grandkids, maybe taking some time and actually gardening with them gives you that sense of contributing to something far beyond yourself. And lastly here, activities with a group. So pleasure and enjoyment, maybe registering for a group garden tour. And you go on this garden tour, you meet people you have never known, get to know some new people, but it's just a fun thing. On the other hand, if you love produce or something, getting involved in a farmer's market or a produce stand, and it's a Saturday, and you go and you work there, and you're sharing these organic or heirloom vegetables with people and getting to talk about gardening and all of that. Now, that looks like work, but it's a source of engagement around something that you love. And then lastly, maybe there is a civic garden club of some kind that actually is involved in planting and tending beautiful gardens in the community for, social benefit. And that, likewise, it seems like work, but it's a source of meaning because you're contributing to the greater good rather than just tending your own garden. So as you can see, this really has nothing to do with gardening per se. What it does have to do is changing your perspective and being able to survey something that you're interested in or something that's important to you and see it from all these different directions. Now, what you have in front of you, of course, is the blank version of this. And I am not guessing that you would get something in all 9 boxes, although you might. But we're going to take a little time here now And we're going to do this in a couple phases or a couple stages. But the first is to give you a little time just to think and start writing some down. And I'm going to suggest something. And anything you write in here is worthwhile. However, this pleasure and enjoyment, those come the easiest. So my suggestion for today, as a brain teaser, is to start with things that are engaging or challenging or meaning and purposeful. And if possible, I'd also take, the tougher part and think about things you might do with another or with a group. Now, for you, this probably isn't going to be about gardening. I mean, you literally could be doing something around here about starting a foundation, right? It's pretty far from gardening, and it might in fact be a source of great meaning and purpose, and you have to collect or combine a group of people to reach that common objective. So it can be about anything, but this is about how you structure these experiences. So if you can focus on here, but all 9 of these anything you can write down, just a few words, a phrase. It doesn't have to be real deep. This is the beginning, the glimmering. And if you have activities you've already done in the past that are good examples of these, capture those now, because those are the themes in your past that maybe will pay off in the future. Does this make sense? So just, we're going to take about 5 minutes. So put your thinking cap on and just see how far you get with any of these. On your mark, get set. So by the sound in the room and the looks on people's faces, I wish I could hear about some of these activities. But come on back. And today, remember, this is not, come on back, come on back, come on back. So this isn't so much an action plan, although it might be for a few of you, as much as these are stepping stone ideas, right? These are the first idea in a given direction, and what a stepping stone isn't the destination, right? It's a step you take that leads to another step, that leads to another step. Sometimes you end up in a direction you didn't anticipate. But remember the reticular activating system where we teach our brain to look for something and then we don't have to consciously be looking for it? Part of the reason for this exercise is to train your brain to start looking for these engaging and meaningful activities to do with other people or on your own, because you'll start to notice those as you navigate the world. The other thing about stepping stones is that as these ideas progress, here's something you might discover, and that is that these intentions we have or the goals that we set, depending what stage of life we're in or what age of life we're in, they take on different kinds of importance. And so when you were in high school or in college, when you were in the first age of life, right, you certainly had aspirations and goals. And as you moved to the second age, those changed and they grew and they developed in certain ways. Well, how might these be unique for the third age, right? The age of midlife, freedom, reduced responsibility, but still health and opportunity. And what's different about retirement or the third age is that we know that time is limited. We hope that we live a long time. We hope we're healthy a long time. But these aspirations and inspirations and goals that you set for the third age, they have a different quality, right? Because you're not at the beginning of life, you're at midlife, approaching later in life. And when you get to the fourth age, you probably, it's not as easy to do these things. So not to give a sense of urgency, but a sense of importance to some of the things that you have on your list, I would say that your aspirations might grow as you think about this, or you might think of things you want to aspire to, but then pull back from and saying, well, that would be, I couldn't accomplish that, or it might be too much work, or people wouldn't allow me or want me to do that. You get some big ideas. So I just want to close with an idea, not Frank, but Steve Jobs. And so, as you know, Steve Jobs didn't go to college, but he was invited to give the commencement address at Stanford. So, pretty good for a college dropout, right? And he still looked good at this point, but I'm pretty sure that he'd been diagnosed with cancer, and so he was reflective, probably at this point in his life. And while it was a long address, and an excellent address and worth reading if you haven't, one part jumped out at me that is relevant, not just for college students graduating, but for people thinking about midlife and the third age. And what he said was this: so I honestly suggest to you that the aspirations that come to you for the third age or for retirement, this really is, it's your opportunity, knowing that your time here on earth is limited, that there may be some important things, some incredible things that you came here to do, things that you should do, and for whatever reason, work, family, something has kept you from those, and that if you know what those things are, that this stage of life may be the time for you to do it. And I urge you to think about that and to go forth and make it happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us here today, and we appreciate you coming. We would love to hear your feedback on the program if you have time to give us an evaluation form, and we'll also send it by email. One of our goals at Altair really is to provide programs like this that have connection with different parts of your life, not just the pure financial and the pure investment, but other parts of your life as well. So we would love your suggestions on things you'd like to see us cover in the future, whether at a program like this or something through even a webinar or a small group or things like that. We're always looking at different client education opportunities. So thanks for being with us here today, and have a great afternoon.